The owner, Larry Silverstein, of the entire complex, got on TV and said that they had blown up Building 7. He said they pulled it, demolition. Well, Silverstein owned them all.
Oh, Silverstein owned all the buildings.
Yeah.
How many buildings are gone?
All of them.
How many is that?
That's right. That plane wasn't, that building wasn't hit by a plane.
9 buildings are gone.
Yeah.
Thousands of people lost their
That
lives.
building.
Hundreds more.
And there's an official U.S. government plan to carry out the attacks.
He imploded that building on himself.
He admitted it. He said it on television.
He brought that building out.
Yes. Larry Silverstein.
So you understand?
Larry Silverstein on America Rebuilding on PBS said that they blew up Building 7.
Building up 7. Even though.
He saw it. Did you see it on PBS?
Yeah, he pulled it.
He said on PBS, he said, we pulled the building. PBS.
Oh, yeah, he pulled the building.
Pelted by debris when the North Tower collapsed. 7 burned until late afternoon, allowing occupants to evacuate to safety.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Yeah, he said we're going to pull. He said we're going to pull the building. Silverstein said we're going to pull the building.
And we got the firemen saying they pulled it. I mean, Silverstein goes on PBS and says it, and we're the weirdos when he says it on TV. Unbelievable. Let's see that one more time.
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
It takes demolition experts weeks to prepare for the destruction of a building. How do they do it on 9/11 in just a few hours? In the tragic days after 9/11, many prominent engineers across the world went public and said there's no way that fire destroyed any of those buildings. It's never happened to a modern building. Buildings have burned for 6-7 days before, and it hasn't happened. The answer was hidden in plain view. Larry Silverstein went on PBS and said that they had pulled the building, demolition term for destroying it. In fact, the local public radio station was told that they were going to demolish Building 7. But since then, the public has been told to be quiet, not to ask questions. And the government hasn't even given us an official story of why Building 7 fell. They say they think fire caused it to fall. And in case you're wondering what pull it means, here's another example, where they again use the term pull it to mean controlled demolition of buildings. Months after 9/11, the remains of 4, 5, and 6 were destroyed. Here's a clip from the same PBS documentary, where the head of engineering for the city of New York describes pull it as a controlled demolition.
By mid-December, the Department of Design and Construction had leveled World Trade Center buildings 4 and 5.
Hello? Oh, we're getting ready to pull Building 6.
We had to be very careful how we demolished Building 6. We were worried about the Building 6 coming down and then damaging the slurry wall, so we wanted that particular building to fall within a certain area.
There's a certain excitement in the air of bringing the last structure down at the World Trade Center.
Seconds after 7 collapsed, this is what Dan Rather had to say about it.
Large building, in most other cities would be one of the largest buildings in town probably. Trade Center Building 7 has collapsed. Now here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Just in case you missed it, here it is again.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down. Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
This is a photo taken 1 second into Building 7's collapse. Notice the crimp. If we look at other controlled demolitions, we see that they first blow one of the central columns so the building falls in on itself. If you don't do this, the building falls outward and has a wider collapse radius and can damage surrounding structures. This was not the case with Building 7. Building 7 had a classic crimp or wedge. Its central column was blown out first, so it didn't structurally damage buildings just a few feet away from it.
Building 7, while I was listening to live feed from our local public radio station later in the afternoon, they talked about Building 7. Building 7 was fine. There was no airplane that hit it. And then they even began to ruminate on the air about demolishing the building. I said, well, I don't know. I mean, you can put out fires. You know, why would you talk about demolishing a building that, you know, it wasn't hit by anything? You know, the fires weren't bad or anything like that.
What was in Building 7? Well, the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, FEMA, U.S. Secret Service, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the city's main command bunker, overseeing the entire operation. That's what was in Building 7, a structure that was over-engineered, that could stand thousands and thousands and thousands of degrees of temperature for days if need be. But it collapsed in just a few seconds. Here we are, smack dab, right in the middle of Silverstein Properties. In the next few minutes, we're going to talk about Mr. Silverstein and go over the history of the World Trade Center complex and some very serious questions that need to be answered. You know, it's interesting to note that Larry Silverstein bought this building many, many years ago. This was the only building he bought in the complex. But 2 months before 9/11, he bought the entire complex, all 7 buildings, and took out a record insurance policy on them for over $3 billion, which he's now been paid. In fact, he tried to get even more. He wanted $7 billion on an original $200 million investment that they made on the entire complex when he leased the whole structure. Mr. Silverstein did quite nicely in his investment. Also, Mr. Silverstein, quote, with a shadowy group of investors, according to the Chicago Tribune, just bought the Sears Tower, one of the next big targets the government's been saying. We hope and pray that nothing ever bad happens, and that's why we're here exposing who may have motives in not stopping further events. The command center for Rudolph Giuliani was in this building. Rudolph Giuliani had his command bunker in this structure, and so did the CIA. It wasn't just the city of New York. The CIA, the FBI were all based in this building. And Rudolph Giuliani told ABC News that he got a call that morning about 8 hours before this collapse, before a fire even started, and was told, get out of Building 7. And he left to a FEMA command base that had already been set up the night before, which he's now admitted in congressional testimony, right down the street by the harbor. A lot of interesting timing. And since 9/11, Giuliani's gone into the terror fighting business, and he's made hundreds of millions of dollars with Giuliani and Associates. Interesting. And then, of course, we have George Bush's youngest brother, Marvin Bush, running security on the complex. And, of course, his contract, by the way, ended on the morning of 9/11. So that's another interesting facet to all of this. None of it adds up. But guess who ran security on these buildings? Marvin Bush, brother of the president, son of the former president, or the former CIA director. Marvin Bush ran security for this whole complex. And guess when his 2-year contract ended? This is the Associated Press, on September 11th. And where did the media pick up on this story? From Barbara Bush's own memoir, Reflections. She wrote about it in the book. Then you have the firefighters telling Associated Press reporters to get back, to get away from the building, that Building 7 was about to come down. And then it magically did come down. And then the University of New York and the U.S. Geological Survey, federal and state, both seismographs picked up explosions going off, the classical pattern of a controlled demolition. He said that they made the decision on the afternoon of 9/11 to go ahead and pull or demolish Building 7, and that they gave the order and watched the building go down. Building 7 is further away from the towers and was not hit by planes. It's further away from the towers than buildings right across the street like the Millennium Hilton and others. So if your building's owned by Larry Silverstein, it collapses because he's got a big fat insurance policy. But if your building's closer and owned by somebody else, it doesn't get damaged at all. Why is the story of Building 7 so important? Why have we spent so much time on it? Because the official story is that the 2 planes that hit Tower 1 and 2, the big 110-story buildings, caused them to collapse, even though a modern steel building had never collapsed from fire. But then we have Building 7 that was further away than any of the buildings in the complex, that later in the afternoon got a few small fires in it and collapsed. Now they have almost rebuilt Building 7 on the exact same spot. And look, buildings right next to it, even though it collapsed on fire, didn't even get that much damage. And then we have this huge building that was right beside Tower 1 and 2 that was hit by giant chunks of the building that did catch on fire, but nothing collapsed. The difference between that building and the new Building 7 is that Larry Silverstein doesn't own that building. Larry Silverstein doesn't own the Millennium Hilton that was closer than Building 7. But every building he owned either caught on fire or mysteriously collapsed. There has been over 100 uncontrolled fires in skyscrapers in the last 50 years, and never has one collapsed or come close to collapsing from fire. Only earthquakes and demolitions have brought these modern structures down.
Pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.